Imagine you're walking through the bright, busy streets of New York City in the 1970s. Everything seems normal, until you hear about a man who lived a double life. By day, he was a quiet dad who worked with computers. By night, he was a monster hiding in plain sight. This is a chilling story of Richard Cottingham, the man they called the torso killer, and the secrets he kept buried for decades. To everyone who knew him, Richard Cottingham was a definition of boring. He lived in a nice house in New Jersey with his wife and 3 kids. He had a steady job as a computer operator for a big insurance company in Midtown Manhattan. He wore plain clothes, spoke softly, and looked like the kind of neighbor you'd trust to watch your dog or mow your lawn. But when the sun went down and his shift ended, Richard didn't always go straight home. Instead, he haunted the shadows of Times Square. Back then, Times Square wasn't the tourist-friendly place with giant cartoon characters that it is today. It was a rough, dangerous area filled with dark alleys and people looking for trouble. Richard moved through these streets like a ghost, looking for victims that the world might not miss. For years, he managed to keep these 2 lives completely separate. At home, he was Dad. In the city, he was becoming a nightmare. He was incredibly clever at tricking people. He used his nice guy appearance to make women feel safe, but once they were alone with him, his true personality came out. The police started finding horrifying scenes in hotel rooms. These weren't just normal crimes. They were meant to shock and confuse the authorities. He would leave victims in ways that earned him his scary nickname, the Torso Killer, because he tried to make it impossible for the police to identify who the people were. He thought he was the smartest person in the room, and for a long time, the police had no idea that the suburban dad from New Jersey was the one behind the chaos. He felt powerful because he was outsmarting everyone. While the city was paralyzed with fear, Richard was sitting at his office desk, typing away at his computer, pretending to be just another face in the crowd. He believed he would never be caught, and that confidence made him even more dangerous. But as we're about to see, even the most careful villains eventually make a mistake. For over a decade, Richard thought he was invisible. He was so confident that he started taking bigger risks, thinking he was untouchable. But in May 1980, his dark streak finally hit a wall. It happened at a hotel in New Jersey, not far from where he lived his normal life. Richard had lured a young woman to a room, believing it would be just another night where he could do whatever he wanted and disappear into the morning fog. But this time, something was different. The woman realized she was in grave danger and did something incredibly brave. She fought back. She didn't just stay quiet. She screamed with everything she had. In the hallway of the hotel, a security guard heard those piercing screams. Usually, hotels like that were noisy, but these screams sounded like someone was fighting for their life. The guard didn't hesitate. He ran toward the sound and hammered on the door. Richard, startled and panicking because his perfect plan was falling apart, tried to bolt. He burst out of the room and ran down the hallway, but he wasn't fast enough. The police were called immediately, and they tackled him before he could reach his car. When they caught him, they found a bag he was carrying. Inside weren't just everyday items. There were handcuffs, knives, and things that proved he wasn't just a nice computer guy. The police were stunned. They looked at this middle-aged man with his messy hair and plain clothes and couldn't believe they had caught a monster. At first, they only charged him for what happened that night. But as a detective started looking into his past, they realized his face matched descriptions from other crimes. They began connecting the dots between the suburban dad and the terrifying torso killer cases from New York. Even after he was caught and sent to prison with a sentence so long he would never leave, Richard stayed quiet. He sat in his cell for years, holding onto his secrets like a prize. He knew where the bodies were buried, and he knew how many people he had truly hurt. But he wouldn't tell a soul. He wanted to keep the power. It took decades of waiting before he finally decided to open his mouth and tell the world the truth about just how many lives he had taken. For over 30 years, Richard Cottingham sat behind iron bars, watching the world change through a small prison window. He was an old man now, but his mind was still sharp, and he was still playing a game. The police knew he was responsible for several deaths, but they had a gut feeling, a dark, sinking suspicion, that the number was much, much higher. They just couldn't prove it. Enter a detective named Robert Anzalotti. Robert wasn't like the other officers. He was patient. He knew that to get a monster to talk, you couldn't just yell at him. You had to treat him like a person. For 15 years, Robert visited Richard in prison. He didn't come with handcuffs. He came with pizza, cookies, and a listening ear. They would sit in a small room, and Robert would show him old photographs of girls who had gone missing in the 1960s and 70s, girls whose families were still waiting for answers. At first, Richard would just smirk. He loved the attention. He loved knowing that he held the keys to these mysteries. It was like a game of cat and mouse, but the cat was behind bars and the mouse was a detective trying to find the truth. Richard would drop tiny hints, like crumbs of bread, leading Robert down a long, dark path. He would say things like, "That bridge looks familiar," or "I might have been in that town on a Tuesday." Then something shifted. Maybe it was because Richard was getting older and realized he would never be free again, or maybe he just wanted to brag about how successful his evil life had been. He started to confess. One by one, he began admitting to crimes that no one had even linked to him. He talked about girls he had taken from malls, from street corners, and from parks. The numbers started to climb. It wasn't just 5 or 10 people. Richard claimed he had hurt up to 100 people. The detectives were horrified. As he spoke, he described the scenes with such detail, what the weather was like, what the victims were wearing, and exactly where he had left them, that the police knew he wasn't making it up. He was finally emptying his chest of secrets, and the weight of what he was saying was enough to crush anyone listening. Robert Anzalotti sat there, recording every word, realized he was sitting across from one of the most prolific shadows in history. Each confession brought a tiny bit of peace to a family that had been wondering for 40 years what happened to their daughter, but it also painted a picture of a man who felt absolutely no sorry for what he had done. He wasn't confessing because he felt bad. He was confessing because he wanted to be remembered as the best at being bad. As the months turned into years, the small room in the prison became a vault of lost history. Richard wasn't just talking anymore. He was drawing. With a shaky hand, the old man began sketching maps of places that had changed completely since the 1960s. He drew trees that were no longer there and buildings that had been torn down decades ago. He remembered the world exactly as it was when he was hunting in the shadows. Detective Anzalotti would take these sketches and drive out to remote woods or quiet fields. It was like a dark treasure hunt, but instead of gold, they were looking for closure. In some cases, the police would dig in spots Richard pointed out, and they would find evidence that had been resting under the dirt for 40 or 50 years. It proved that Richard's memory was like a high-definition camera. He hadn't forgotten a single face or a single scream. One of the most heartbreaking parts of these confessions was how normal the victims were. They were teenagers who had gone to the mall to buy a record, or young women walking home from a movie. Richard described how he would pull up in his car, look like a friendly businessman, and offer them a ride because it was raining or because they looked tired. Because he looked like everyone's dad. They trusted him. That trust was the last thing they ever gave. The news of these confessions started hitting the headlines. Families who had spent their entire lives wondering if their sisters or daughters had simply run away finally got a phone call from police. It wasn't the news they wanted, but it was the truth. Richard sat in his cell, watching the news reports about himself, almost like he was a fan of his own horror movie. He enjoyed seeing the police scramble to keep up with his stories. But even with all these gifts of information, Richard was still holding back. He would play a cruel game where he'd start a story, get to the most important part, and then suddenly stop. He'd lean back, smile, and say, "Maybe we'll talk about that one next week if the pizza is good." He was using the lives of his victims to buy himself better snacks and more company in prison. He knew that as long as he had one more secret, the world would still have to pay attention to him. The detectives realized they were dealing with a man who didn't have a heart, but he did have a legacy of pain. And as they prepared for the final set of interviews, they knew they were entering the deepest, darkest part of the torso killer's mind, the place where he kept the secrets he promised he would never, ever tell. As Richard got older and his health began to fade, the atmosphere in the interrogation room changed. The game was reaching its final minutes. Detective Anzalotti knew that time was running out to get the remaining names and locations before Richard took those secrets to his grave. The detective pushed harder, asking about specific cases that had remained cold for nearly 50 years. Cases of young girls who vanished without a trace, leaving nothing behind but broken families and empty bedrooms. In these final meetings, Richard's voice became a rasping whisper. He started talking about the others, the ones he hadn't mentioned because he wanted to keep them just for himself. He described how he would drive for hours through the quiet suburbs of New Jersey and the rainy streets of New York, looking for anyone who looked lonely or lost. He admitted that his normal life at the insurance company was just a mask he wore so he could stay free to do his dock work. The most chilling part wasn't just the number of people he hurt. It was how he remembered them. He didn't remember them as people with dreams or families. He remembered them like trophies. He could recall the exact color of a ribbon in a girl's hair or the brand of soda a teenager was drinking when he approached her in 1968. It was as if he had a library in his head, filled with books of pain that he could pull off the shelf whenever he wanted to feel powerful again. Even as an old man in a wheelchair, hooked up to medical machines, Richard had to face the families he had destroyed. In a quiet courtroom, the relatives of his victims sat just feet away from the monster who had haunted their nightmare for decades. Some cried, some stared with cold anger, and some simply breathed a sigh of relief because, after half a century, they finally knew the name of the man who took their loved ones. Richard didn't say he was sorry. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just sat there, looking like a tired grandfather. While the judge added more and more years to his prison sentence, thousands of years that he could never possibly serve, the torso killer had finally been stripped of his mystery. He was no longer a scary ghost in the shadows. He was just an old man in a jumpsuit who had run out of lies. But even as the cell door clicked shut for the last time, the detectives knew the map wasn't completely finished. There are still girls missing from that era, and there are still stories Richard started but never finished. He left the world with a map that has many holes in it, a final cruel trick to ensure that even when he is gone, people will still be looking for the truth he chose to hide. Even though Richard is behind bars and his hair has turned white, the story doesn't truly end with a jail cell. The torso killer left behind a trail of mystery that even the best detectives are still trying to follow. Because Richard was so good at living a double life for so long, the police believe there are victims out there that he hasn't even mentioned yet. Names that have been forgotten by everyone except the families who still have a faded photo on their mantelpiece. Think about how scary that is. A man who worked a normal office job, who probably had a world's best dad mug on his desk, was secretly keeping a mental diary of hundreds of crimes. Every time a new bone is found in a forest in New Jersey or construction crew digs up an old basement in New York, the same question pops into the detectives' minds. Is this another one of Richard's? The detectives who spent years talking to him say that Richard's memory was like a haunted library. He could tell you what the radio was playing the night he took someone, or what the moon looked like, but he would never say he felt sorry. To him, these weren't people. They were just chapters in a book he wrote to make himself feel important. He enjoyed the fact that for 40 years, he was winning against the police. In the small towns where these things happened, the older people still remember the vibes of the 70s. How parents started locking their doors and how kids weren't allowed to walk to the park alone anymore. Richard didn't just hurt individuals. He stole the feeling of safety from entire neighborhoods. He was a boogeyman who turned out to be a real person living right down the street. As we look at the final pages of his story, we see a man who is now weak and old, but the damage he did is still fresh for the people left behind. The police continue to look through his old sketches and his confusing riddles, hoping to find just one more name to check off the list. They want to make sure that no one Richard hurt is left alone in the dark. Richard Cottingham thought he would be remembered as a genius who outsmarted the world. Richard Cottingham thought he would be remembered as a genius who outsmarted the world. A reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters don't have claws or fur. They wear suits, work in offices, and go home to their families, all while carrying secrets that could fill 100 graveyards. While Richard sits in his cell, there is one person who can never truly stop thinking about him, Detective Robert Anzalotti. For over 20 years, Robert lived with Richard's voice in his head. He spent more time talking to this monster than he did with some of his own friends. Why? Because Robert knew that every time he brought Richard a slice of pepperoni pizza or a cup of coffee, he was trading a snack for a soul, a chance to bring one more missing person home. The detective described their meetings as psychological chess. Richard would try to shock Robert with gruesome details just to see if the detective would flinch. If Robert looked disgusted, Richard would stop talking because he felt he had won. So, Robert had to sit there with a stone-cold face, nodding and listening to things that would give most people nightmares for a lifetime. He had to pretend to be Richard's friend, just to get the truth. Think about the weight of that. Robert would go home to his own family, sit at the dinner table, and try to forget the maps Richard had drawn that day. He had to balance being a good dad with being the only man on earth who could get the torso killer to talk. It was a heavy burden to carry, but Robert did it because he promised the families of the victims that he wouldn't give up until every cold case file was closed. Eventually, Robert retired from the police force, but even then, the phone didn't stop ringing. Other detectives from all over the United States, and even from other countries, called him to ask, "Do you think Richard was in my town in 1972? Could he be responsible for our missing person?" Robert became the keeper of Richard's dark history, the only person who could tell if Richard was lying or telling the truth based on the look in the old man's eyes. Richard loved this. He loved that even after he was caught, he was still the center of attention. He loved that a top-tier detective had to spend half his life trying to understand his twisted mind. In Richard's head, he wasn't a prisoner. He was a teacher, and the police were his students. This was his final act of cruelty, making sure that even the good guys had to live in his dark world just to do their jobs. But Robert had the last laugh. By getting those confessions, he took away Richard's power to keep those secrets forever. He turned Richard's trophies back into daughters, sisters, and friends. The detective proved that even if a monster hides for 50 years, the light of the truth will eventually find them, no matter how deep they try to bury it. The story of Richard Cottingham, the torso killer, eventually reaches a quiet, cold end. After decades of playing games with the law, after hundreds of hours of interviews, the man who once thought he was a ghost haunting the bright lights of New York City became nothing more than a fading memory in a sterile prison cell. But even as the cell door stays locked, the world outside has changed forever. Because of the brave work of detectives like Robert Anzalotti, the mystery that gripped the United States and shocked people as far away as the UK and Germany finally has a conclusion. Families who spent 50 years staring at the front door, hoping their loved ones would walk through it. Families who spent 50 years staring at the front door, hoping their loved ones would walk through it. Families who spent 50 years staring at the front door, hoping their loved ones would walk through it. Richard Cottingham wanted to be a legend of fear. He wanted people to whisper his name in the dark. But in the end, he didn't win. He spent the last years of his life surrounded by gray wolves, dependent on the very people he tried to outsmart. He didn't die a powerful mastermind. He died a man who had to confess his darkest deeds just to get a stranger to sit and talk to him for an hour. His power didn't come from his crimes. It came from his secrets, and once those secrets were told, he had nothing left. His power didn't come from his crimes. It came from his secrets, and once those secrets were told, he had nothing left. There are detectives who never sleep, families who never stop loving, and a truth that refuses to stay buried in the date. Today, the streets of Times Square are filled with tourists and bright billboards, and the quiet suburbs of New Jersey are peaceful once again. The Torso Killer is a chapter in a history book that we hope never has to be written again. As the sun sets on this dark tale, we remember the victims, not as names on a list, but as people who were loved. Their stories are finally complete, and the shadows that Richard Cottingham tried to hide in have finally been washed away by the light. Today, the silence surrounding the Torso Killer is no longer a mystery. The game is over. The secrets are no longer buried. And while nothing can undo the pain of the past, the world is a little safer now that the man with two faces has finally been forced to show his real one. The story of Richard Cottingham also reminds us of the relentless determination of investigators like Robert Anzalotti, whose persistence helped bring long-buried truths into the light. Because of that determination, families who waited decades finally received answers that history almost left behind. But stories like this remind us of something deeper. There are still mysteries in the world waiting to be uncovered. Stories hidden in the shadows of history, and truths that refuse to stay buried forever. If this story kept you thinking, imagine the many other cases, secrets, and chilling histories that are still waiting to be told. So if you want to explore more dark stories, unsolved mysteries, and true crime cases that history almost forgot, make sure you follow the channel and stay with us. Because sometimes the most disturbing stories are the ones that are still waiting in the dark. And if you've made it this far, I know you enjoy stories like this. Stories that dive deep into the shadows of history and reveal the truths many people never hear about. So don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next story, because the next mystery might be even more chilling than this one.